We are live, so we're going to jump right in and get started. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. I think for, we got to, um, yeah, so I am super grateful for all of the interest we got in this event, and thank you so much for joining us. I know a number of you on this call are doing kind of essential humanitarian work as part of this crisis, so I especially want to express our gratitude for taking a few minutes to have this conversation with us. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a new organization that's focused on advancing solutions and building political momentum towards addressing the problem of concentrated corporate power in our society. We know that concentrated corporate power is really at the root or exacerbating so many of the challenges and injustices that we're all fighting against. Just to give a few examples, each year we know that monopolies make the average family $5,000 poorer due to lower wages and higher prices. If corporate power was as decentralized as it was in the early 1980s, we know that median compensation would be $10,000 higher today. And those are just kind of a few examples of some of the real world impacts that concentrated corporate power has. I think we think of monopolies as a vehicle by which a relative handful of people have come to control enormous amounts of wealth and power over many aspects of our everyday lives. That power isn't only economic, it is political. It's manifested through bullying workers, other businesses, politicians, through infinite resources for lobbying and public relations, frequent use of the revolving door, and pushing government to work well for them and not for others. We got to this crisis point, in part, just to do some quick scene setting for the conversation, because in the 1970s and 80s, progressives and conservatives decided that it was good policy to allow economic power to become more and more concentrated and deregulate the financial and corporate sector. That's really been the default approach ever since across both parties, and now monopolies are systemic all across the economy. That's true for big industries like online retail and media and healthcare and food, and in niche industries like cheerleading and software. So we're kind of coming together today because one of the things that the CARES Act did was to empower the Federal Reserve to oversee a huge transfer of wealth and power to large corporations in the financial industry through its lending programs. So the bailouts will pump essentially $13,000 for every man, woman, and child in America to big banks, private equity, and large corporations with virtually no strings attached. So I think it's a critical moment to take stock of where we are and how anti-monopoly policy fits into the response to coronavirus and more broadly into these progressive fights for economic and social justice. And we're really lucky today to have Commissioner Rohit Chopra and Professor Zephyr Teachout joining us to answer questions and to share their insights into some of these big questions that we're starting to grapple with. I think neither of them need any introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Commissioner Chopra has been a longtime leader for consumers in the context of these questions of concentrated corporate power. He helped to launch and lead the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He oversaw some really big fights against predatory student lenders and for-profit colleges. And now he is a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, where he oversees antitrust laws and consumer protection. Zephyr Teachout, she is a professor at Fordham University Law School. She is the author of Corruption in America and the forthcoming book, Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Tech, Big Ag, and Big Money. She ran for Attorney General and for Congress, governor, and is a impactful and influential leader and advocate for all of these issues. So we're super grateful to have both of you join us today. For a quick run of show, Commissioner Chopra is going to talk for a few minutes, then we'll give the floor over to Zephyr, and then we want to have a conversation and take questions from you. So please use the chat box, the Q&A, or raise your hand, and I'll moderate that conversation. But thanks so much. Commissioner Chopra, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. And just wanted to confirm that you can hear me okay.
I can hear you.
Terrific. So I want to thank everyone for joining, as it's now more and more weeks into this devastating situation our country and our world find ourselves in, with unemployment spiking to levels that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, to failures of small businesses that are occurring all over the country, and to a healthcare system that is just breaking. And I know that many of you come from different places, whether you're in advocacy or think tanks or other organizations. And I want this to be relevant to all of you. I don't want this to be a discussion just about law or antitrust, but I want us to step back and think about what is some of the core issues that we're seeing as the problems with the situation we're finding ourselves in. And more, we're seeing that government is unable to really deliver because companies are really calling the shots. We have never been more reliant on certain healthcare companies, retail companies, and tech companies like Amazon. The government is looking to some of the largest firms in the economy to figure out how they will actually solve problems, because we are ill-equipped to do it ourselves. We're seeing companies that are sitting on cash who are able to exploit the situation. And whether it's sector by sector, we are seeing how these problems are hurting real people. Now, Sarah mentioned the bailouts and the Federal Reserve. Let's be honest with ourselves. It should be no surprise that the biggest banks in America failed to effectively deliver for small businesses. This is what happens when you eliminate any local connection, when you have companies that can impose regulations and one size fits all solutions. And of course, they can shuffle the cards to make sure that their biggest clients are helped at the expense of the broader population. Look what we're seeing in agriculture. Our food supply is also breaking. We're seeing at the same time farmers who are throwing out vegetables and dumping milk in bodies of water while grocery shelves are empty, because a fewer and fewer number of these firms control the supply chain from soup to nuts. And the more we are heavily reliant on a single source, this is where failure can have catastrophic effects. And it should be no surprise in industry after industry, whether it's medical supplies or any of the industries we need to be delivering right now, much of the chaos is created by unchecked consolidation. And I think what this is a time we all need to think about is this question of resilience, our ability to respond, our ability to recover from this crisis means we must be agile, we must be resilient. But what is the enemy of resilience? That's efficiency. Efficiency means stretching that rubber band as far as you can, but now it's snapping. Efficiency means stripping the meat off the bone until there's nothing left. It means putting more and more pressure on single points of failure that when they go down, we all get hurt. And I think a lot about how investors or smart business people would think about it. We all know that we should diversify. We don't put all of our eggs in one basket. We don't put all of our money in one stock. We spread it around so that when things go wrong, we don't go down with it. And I'm just worried that all of this unchecked consolidation is playing out in an extreme form that is harming our ability both to respond and to recover. And I should say, mergers are not going to be the saving grace of an economic recovery. It is a fantasy and a fallacy that this will be our savior. And really, it's with limited exceptions, certain firms that might be failing, but overwhelmingly the data show that mergers kill jobs, they suppress wages, and they create other harms that we need to make sure we are guarding against. So if we want to protect the fabric of the economy, if we want to promote small businesses, if we want to promote innovation, we cannot succumb to the forces of vulture companies and financiers. We need to make sure that we are resilient, we are responsive, and that we're putting the pause on dangerous mergers that are going to block us from responding to the crisis and recovering. So Sarah, I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing people's questions in the conversation with you and Zephyr.
Thanks so much, Commissioner Chopra. Zephyr?
Great, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Commissioner Chopra, who I recommend to everybody to read his wonderful opinions, often in dissent, but not always. And he's been an incredible leader for many years, and an incredible leader throughout this crisis. And I want to thank all of you who are on the call today. I know we're in a moment of triage, but as we all know, moments of triage can be incredibly dangerous. So many of you are working on absolutely urgent campaigns to figure out how we can get basic needs met to keep people alive, able to eat, and protected in the most essential ways. The risk is that if we respond to this moment solely as a triage moment, we'll miss the other thing that's happening, which is that I really see this as a constitutional moment, where the structure of society is being decided. This is a moment when power is being allocated in very clear and very dangerous ways, and that we all collectively, whether you're working on climate, working on particular labor campaigns, working on, I don't know the whole range of people who are here, but you're coming from all these different backgrounds, that we all need to come together and understand the power dynamic and the power moment that we're facing right now. I had my students read the CARES Act as if they had come from outer space, to say, well, what kind of document is this? If you see this as a constitutional document, an unprecedented amount of money being spent, what is this document about? And several of them said, it looks like it's a document that gives the Treasury the power to shape our economy. And that if you read it as a constitution, you see this extraordinary transfer of power away from democratically governed decision-making to the Treasury Secretary. So I want to suggest that the triage approach and the constitutional approach aren't opposed to each other. They're different ways of understanding where we are at this moment, and we have to bring both the triage and the constitutional approach to our fights going forward. And so I want to give one example of the ways in which this moment can dangerously lead to greater consolidation, and that greater consolidation will hurt our health, the safety of our workers, the wages paid by workers, and the vibrancy of our community. And that example is Amazon. Prior to this pandemic, Amazon was already in a hugely dominant position, that about half of online, dominating about half of online sales. Its sales are massively up. Spending was up 35% on Amazon, we think, as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's continuing to go up at the same time as tens of thousands of retail establishments are just being absolutely wiped out. So while Amazon is growing in power and we are becoming more and more dependent on it, and its expected value is shooting up. People are talking about a $2 trillion valuation in a couple of years from now. What are the whole society impacts on them, impacts of that? Well, one that we can see right now is that Amazon plays all these different roles. It tries to act like it's just one thing, but that Amazon's power as the online marketplace of choice is being used by Amazon to squeeze out other parties who might want to be involved in fulfillment, that is, warehousing and shipping. Well, why might we, during this pandemic moment, want options of different places to be doing warehousing? One is people need stuff fairly quickly, but another is that we need warehouse options where workers are treated better. And we need to have greater power with we need the labor movement to have greater power in negotiating with the warehouse facilities. And if Amazon is shutting that down, saying we're going to use our marketplace power to make sure nobody else is building better warehousing where they're treating workers better, then they have even more power to disrespect and shut down and silence, including illegally silence, the workers in those warehouses. So that's bad for the workers. It's also bad for all of our health. It's also puts Amazon in a position where it can squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and take all the value, all the profit made by sellers who sell on its site. Now that hurts those sellers, but it also hurts the workers who work for those producers. So it's gradually, as a great ally of ours, Stacy Mitchell at ILSR says, Amazon isn't just a part of the economy, it wants to be the economy. And Amazon is anti-labor, all about the bottom line, all about consolidating its own power, not about the thriving, diverse, exciting, worker, dignifying world that we want to live in. So we should be taking this moment not just to be protesting the fact that Amazon isn't providing the necessary PPE for its workers, but also saying, hey, we don't want to live in this consolidated Amazon Facebook world after this pandemic. So let's talk about splitting up Amazon from fulfillment, the Amazon marketplace from Amazon warehousing and fulfillment. Another thing to think about when we look at the CARES Act is, I know that many of you probably see this in the work that you do, but it's really important to understand that monopoly power monopoly power is overwhelmingly white. And that as you see more and more concentrated power, the folks at the top of those companies are white men. If you look at a non-Fortune 500 company, a CEO is 30 times more likely to be run by an African American than a Fortune 500 company. Or you think about right now, the small businesses who are being the most devastated by our current CARES Act response. I live in New York City. The businesses, often immigrant-run businesses that have to pay incredibly high rent, but only have a few employees, the CARES Act doesn't do very much for them because it's designed for companies that have low rent and a high payroll. So the structure of our response so far is wiping out tens of thousands of, and more, hundreds of thousands of small mom and pops entrepreneurs who are far more likely to be Black and brown. And the monopolists who are running away with the cash are overwhelmingly white men. There's so much else to talk about here, but I guess the real thing I want to take this moment to urge you to do is to make sure that whatever we're fighting for, we're bringing an economic power analysis to it, and making sure that we aren't allowing, we were already in a terribly monopolized society 6 months ago. And the worst case scenario is we say, we'll deal with monopoly later. Let's just make sure we get these, our particular demands met now. If we do that, we are putting ourselves in an incredibly weak position for any future negotiation. The medium case scenario is we say, can we at least freeze the power structure? And the best case scenario is that people's minds are, as horrific as this moment is, people's minds are more open now to thinking about how unbelievably important it is to not be in a situation where it turns out we don't have any, we only have one company that we can rely on to get ventilators from, or there's nowhere we can go to get masks, or we're all reliant on a few places for antibiotics. And so people are open to saying, wait, I thought somebody was in charge here. I thought somebody was making sure that we had a resilient system. And as Commissioner Chopra said, it turns out somebody wasn't. Somebody was making sure we had the most fragile system possible without any give and any readiness for crises. So the best case scenario is we take this open imagination and push through an agenda at the local, state, federal level and make part of all of our work a power analysis, which makes sure that we do not allow monopolies to greedily govern us going forward.
Thanks so much, Zephyr. I want to ask, if I can, a question for Commissioner Chopra and then for Zephyr, and then we're getting some questions in the chat. And while we're talking, then other folks can kind of jump into that. So my question for you, Commissioner Chopra, is kind of jumping off of Zephyr's point, which is we have to do two things at once, right? We need to build power among workers and citizens and smaller businesses, but we also need to break power of monopolies and finance and the systems that weave those two together to provide this amount of control over society and the economy. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe for folks that aren't as familiar, how you do that, where we are in this particular fight? Is all hope lost? Should we give up? Are there signs of light and progress? And what it looks like from your kind of perch at the Federal Trade Commission on these broader questions of how we structure markets and structure corporate power in society?
Yeah, sure. I think what you're finding is actually something that I feel optimistic about, is that people across the spectrum are ready to reclaim control over the economy. They don't want to outsource all the decisions to a couple corporations in each sector. They don't want to keep seeing critical infrastructure and production capacity move to China and other countries. They don't want to see a continued reduction in small business formation and continuation of declining wages. And this is an economy that isn't really working. And what we learned from a decade ago after the financial crisis is that even the largest banks who made big mistakes, they got bigger afterward because of the bailouts and had more control over the financial system. We saw so many industries rapidly consolidate, whether it's the airline industry or key parts of the healthcare industry. So here's how I see it. I think this is time for us to remember that we actually can exert and police these markets. We used to do it. We can do it again. So, from my perch at the FTC, the FTC is not, unfortunately, an economic policy agency. It is pretty narrowly focused on, some of the minutia of specific areas of law. And so I think what you're seeing, though, is everyone is now looking and examining under a microscope, what are these agencies doing that might actually be hurting our ability to respond or hurting the recovery? And Zephyr spoke eloquently about how they're especially hurting workers and the ability for a family to be able to provide for themselves. And the idea that mergers and unchecked consolidation will save jobs is a fantasy and a fallacy. It's the opposite. this unchecked consolidation can poison a recovery. It can kill jobs. It can kill small businesses. It can strangle startups before they even get off the ground. And it can undermine local communities and resilience. So I think we're going to have to think big picture, not just narrowly about worker protections, not just narrowly about antitrust or narrowly about specific types of regulations. We're going to need to be thinking about big picture. How are we going to structure markets and fix them so that they deliver real growth, so that businesses are not incentivized just to buy back stock or just to engage in a transaction to kill off a competitor, but to do what we see the data shows works. Invest in plant and equipment, invest in new production capacity. So that's what will create jobs, that's what will raise wages, that's what will keep competitive globally, rather than continuing a policy that works well for a few companies and frankly works well for many of our competitors on the global stage. So I'm optimistic. I think everyone who's involved in work from accountability of the financial system to supporting workers' rights to trying to take on abusive practices in industries across our economy, everyone has a stake in this conversation and in this fight.
Thanks so much. I want to ask one more question to Zephyr, and then we have quite a few teed up in the chat. But how do we think about like practical next steps? So we are in this situation. Trump is president. We've just passed this enormous bailout. There's likely to be future legislative packages advanced. And there is, I think, a new community of people coming together, new conversations happening, kind of quickly around how we can kind of head off this concentration of power. And if we can do that, and kind of the short and long-term set of priorities for thinking about really solving it. And since we do have a lot of advocates on this call and people working in an organizing capacity, what are some of the first, how should we think about solutions, both in terms of specific policies and then kind of creating the political will and the conversations that we need to try to advance those?
Okay, only that, right? I'll be quick. But I actually want to be as practical as possible. So let's say that I am working as an anti-monopolist. I am never going to be pushing for working in New York State, say, or focused on a national bill. I am never going to be pushing something without first checking in with worker advocates to think about the impacts on labor fights. But I would ask that those of you who are on the call from different communities do that same practice with checking in with key leaders in the anti-monopoly movement when you are pushing for an array, a particular bill or set of bills, just to say, okay, I haven't really thought through what are the impacts on consolidation, what are the consolidation impacts, what are the monopoly impacts of the bill I'm pushing through, because we're all going to have to work together on this. So as a practical matter, for instance, when we're looking at the upcoming bailouts, don't turn a blind eye to the Fed power. Don't turn a blind eye to the way the PPP is structured. That really matters for all the safety, worker, and environmental protection fights that you are involved in. So as a practical matter, check in with Sarah or other anti-monopolists, but always bring a power lens and a structure of the economy lens question to big packages. The other part of it is that just as we are increasingly understanding that housing policy is not just local, it's federal. Anti-monopoly policy is not just federal, it's also local. So for instance, New York State right now, in this current fight, could be doing a lot more to make sure that Amazon isn't using its monopoly power to treat workers badly. And we've seen how France has actually been able to fairly effectively do that. but also New York City can pass laws. So that there are, we often think the only people who can do anti-monopoly is the FTC, when in fact there's a whole array. Congress should be acting, but your state houses should be acting, and cities can be acting. And so when we're rebuilding a sense that we're top heavy, we're poorly constitutionally designed, look at your city and state opportunities as well as your federal ones.
That's great. Let me ask first question from one of our participants. You know, some progressive Democrats in the House, as we all know, are pushing for a merger moratorium unless the company is about to fail or in bankruptcy. I'll let you, Zephyr, talk a little bit about this. Do you think that's a good idea? We think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's absolutely essential. You don't want, during a pandemic, basically companies gobbling up other companies. As the commissioner said, we know it tends to be job killing. It's the wrong thing to be doing now. One thing I want to, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Warren are both pushing for this merger moratorium, and I think it's really important that we all get behind them. You may not know this, but we know we have an immoral economy, and the immorality of this economy is revealed more and more every day during this pandemic.
We're already starting to see it right now. We're seeing signs that big pharmacy chains are looking to scoop up more local pharmacies. We're seeing big healthcare companies looking to buy up smaller community healthcare facilities, physician practices, and others. We're seeing investors with trillions of dollars in dry powder, the money that they've been keeping on the sides, ready to go in, and they're ready to go. And I think, look, many people are trying to say, wait, we gotta, if mergers are gonna show that they're gonna kill jobs, you're seeing a lot of people across the spectrum in Congress too saying, we gotta put the pause on this. It is, again, I'm gonna say this again, it is a fantasy and a fallacy that these mergers and unchecked consolidation will help us respond and recover from this crisis. We have seen how moratoriums can delay damage. There was a moratorium, for example, on the creation of a sketchy type of bank called industrial loan companies. Congress put the pause on that and said, you know what, we're just not going to let the banking regulators approve that. Moratoria allows us to put a stop to some of the vulture instincts of those who are finding wounded small businesses who then they can go in and take them over and create more and more market power. And I think Zephyr is right that anti-competitive conduct and monopoly, it's a pickpocket on our economy. It's taking away things that would otherwise allow us to prosper. And you know, the data is just so clear about how much mergers can reduce wages, they make jobs worse, people are less matched to the skills that they have. So I think it's legitimate. Many people are thinking, if we got to position ourselves for the recovery, it's not just about giving people a stimulus check. Of course, we should do that. It's not just about giving loans to small businesses. Of course, we should do that. But it's also about safeguarding the economy from more damage as we try and dig ourselves out of this mess.
And just briefly, like related to this pandemic, think about the loss of hospital beds and the roll-ups of nursing homes by private equity and the extraordinary damage that has caused. And the idea that we would allow, people weren't paying attention to those consolidations at the time, and some local people were often fighting against them. But the idea that there's so many blatant human harms being caused right now because of the extraordinary merger wave we've been living in for decades. And the idea that we would allow that harm to continue instead of pause it seems crazy.
Yeah, I think a couple points. That's why I mentioned that $5,000 number at the beginning of this call, because it is one that's probably a conservative estimate, but I don't think we think about this transfer of wealth that's happening because we have allowed a handful of corporations to take over so many industries, including ones that are critical to life and death, like healthcare and pharmaceuticals, right? And you know, when you put that in the context of the $1,200 stimulus check that families are getting, and then you put that in the context of the $13,000 equivalent loan that big corporations and financial firms are getting, you know, it really drives home how workers and consumers are getting the short end of the stick here in a systematic way. And even when there is an effort to engage in fiscal policy, you are still seeing that pushed into a situation in which big chunks of that $1,200 is going to go right back to Amazon. It's going to go right back to CVS. It's going to go right back to Verizon, right? And that kind of vicious cycle will continue. There's a useful question here that someone just offered up that I want to ask. And I think it's good just from a kind of scene setting perspective, and I'll let either one of you take it. So it goes, the typical way to legally identify potential monopolies is identifying how they are harming consumers. We have just talked about that. However, when it comes to big tech companies like Google and Facebook, where their products are free, how do you fight back against those monopolies? How do you make a coherent case against their monopolistic collection of information? We talked about Amazon, but obviously Facebook and Google now have become these kind of essential intermediaries in the way that we communicate when we're all forced to socially distance ourselves. And just a few weeks ago, it was announced that Facebook and Google are launching kind of competitors to Zoom, in fact, to kind of continue to entrench their market power and the services that they provide during this time. So maybe I'll let either kind of one of you, maybe Zephyr, we just wrote a paper together on this, so we can talk about it a little bit. But I think when you look at the political situation too, you know, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, are at the tip of the spear in the anti-monopoly fight in terms of having kind of bipartisan momentum around hopefully addressing their monopoly power in a fundamental way, with multiple investigations happening across the federal government and a state level. So I think Zephyr probably is best equipped to take this this question, and I can add on too, if helpful.
Yeah, so let's talk about Google and Facebook. Perhaps you may be one of those rare people who can avoid Google and Facebook, although it will not avoid you. It is still collecting information on you. But to be a business owner, you are not going to avoid Google and Facebook because you need them for advertising. To be any kind of creator, of any journalist, newspaper, magazine, any part of our incredibly rich media environment, you basically, if you aren't on Facebook, you cannot reach the people that you most need to reach. So one way to think about it is that it's pretty clear that they have become, and both of them have gobbled up companies. Google once, 1 year, bought a company a week, and Facebook is most famously monopolized in its purchase of, gained even more monopoly control in its purchases of WhatsApp and Instagram. But there is this, they both created these like incredibly, these essential communications facilities. They are the sidewalk and the post office, and they're absolutely essential. They're the places we debate, the places we learn. And they're using that power to do a few really, really dangerous things. One is they are sucking away and making money. They basically are totally dominating the digital ad market, which used to be the way that most news organizations made money, and certainly almost all local and working class news organizations made money. Now, a handful can make money through subscriptions, but the overwhelming majority rely on digital ad dollars. And Google and Facebook are just taking that money, and they're taking it without creating the value themselves. The journalists for the Daily News or the Poughkeepsie Journal are doing the work, and Facebook and Google are taking the money, and it is destroying our news infrastructure. And we don't have to allow that. And it's also really dangerous because both Facebook and Google have a business model that makes money the more time you spend on it. I sometimes think of it like, what if the post office was built on the targeted ad business model in the 1790s? The post office would make sure to send you the most scandalous, outrageous, angry-making information, the stickiest information. Or what if your public library was built on, made money the more salacious the information was? They'd put the white nationalist books up front. And in fact, that is what Facebook and Google do. They prioritize salacious, controversial content because they make more money that way, because people then spend more time engaging with that content. So we've done something crazy, and we've sort of naturalized it. We have allowed our essential communications infrastructure, and it is essential, and it's our communications infrastructure, to be driven by a business model which is terrible for communications, both in that it's destroying our news industry and in that it's prioritizing outrageousness. And we just don't have to do that. So I think that, getting back to the question, is I think we have to do a whole bunch when it comes to big tech. One is say, there's certain kinds of business models you can't have if you are essential infrastructure. You just don't get to do that. And you can call on the public utility tradition. There's a lot of traditions that say if something plays this role, there's certain kinds of business models you can use and you can't use. And second, we do need to break them up. There's a lot of evidence that actually Facebook's bad privacy behavior got a lot worse after the purchase of Instagram, because it was no longer disciplined by competition. So I think maybe in the back of your minds, if you're a progressive listening to this, you say, well, anti-monopoly is fine, but what I really want to do is in some areas do heavy regulation. I think there's a false sense that those are opposing approaches. And it's really important to understand that we break things up in order to be able to regulate them, and vice versa. And we certainly saw this in the big bank, in the Dodd-Frank fights, is that if something is so politically large and so dominant and too big to fail, then it's really hard to regulate it in common sense ways. So that's a longer answer. There's a lot, it's a really rich question. There's a lot to say about it. But I would answer the question to say, we're facing a total crisis in our communications infrastructure, and we should not respond passively to it. We should be demanding that Congress act. And luckily, we have some real leadership right now in the antitrust subcommittee of the judiciary.
Sarah, can I add just one quick thing?
Yes.
I think it's also so important that we start thinking about some of the problems in this sector through the national security lens. We went through a real, and we're continuing to go through a real challenging time when it comes to the role of companies like Huawei. And you actually had the Attorney General of the United States suggest that the United States actually take over certain companies like Ericsson in order to have control over a company and compete against these Chinese giants. And you're hearing people like Sheryl Sandberg say, you got to protect big tech because otherwise we won't be able to compete against China. And actually, this is a very wrong-headed and dangerous way of thinking. The problem we have had is that we don't actually have enough fierce competition to be able to create the innovations that have us safe and our economy growing for decades. I mean, we outsmarted much of the world because we had unleashed innovation by unlocking patents, by by separating companies so that there was more dynamism, more competition. And I am worried that about a notion that we need to protect corporate royalty out of fear tactics, that it's the only way to compete against large Chinese companies that are state affiliated. And sometimes these arguments they make are more an argument that they should be nationalized than they should be protected. It just doesn't make sense to me. So as we think about this, we need to think not just about our economy, not just about all the values that Zephyr has raised about speech and debate and the lifeblood of how our democracy works, but also, how that fits into our national security imperatives as well.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to raise 3 points. So one is that I have a very clever 5-year-old who has figured out how to unlock the bedroom door. So good job on that. The other 2 points are a little bit distinct. So I think one of the things, especially in this conversation, given who's on this call, when it comes to Facebook and Google, that we really have to understand is that local news and local journalism is often how we hold corporations, public officials accountable in the first place. So how can we do our work, and how can we do this work when we see the Cleveland Plain Dealer down to 4 journalists, when we see, every day we're seeing this collapse happen? And obviously it's exacerbated now during the crisis, but this was happening long before. And I think it is really important, as Zephyr pointed out, to just be clear that this is Facebook and Google sitting in the middle, being able to utilize the content and just take all the money. This isn't really necessarily a function of just technology passing these kind of, outdated institutions by. That's a false narrative. We have to have local journalism if we want to hold corporations and public officials accountable. That's so essential. I think the other point, and then I'm going to have one last question before we end this, is that after the last financial crisis, we saw the banking sector get more and more consolidated. And then in this crisis, we see big banks, delegated to distributing a lot of this money to small businesses, really unable to do that in some cases, or prioritizing existing large clients. And you can see how the decisions that we have made to allow consolidation of power to kind of continue to grow over these past 10 years is directly related now to small businesses all across the country, failing, not being able to access the capital they need to continue to survive, both because the government does not have the capacity to provide that direct support. The institutions have been allowed to atrophy. At the same time, we've allowed banking sector to become even more consolidated. Last question, and I think I'm going to add a little bit of a spin to this one. So it goes, given the current political climate, a merger ban is unlikely. Is there a more realistic proposal to better direct effort in the short term? I think I'd like to end just by giving people a sense of what we feel is possible and what the moment demands, and how we should think about this in the context of our politics. I think this notion that, is this too unlikely? Is there something more realistic? It's an important question, but it's also one that kind of tees up a broader sense of, in this space, like, what should we consider the possible, both in the short and long term? Maybe I'll let you both say a few words about that before we wrap up. You want to?
Commissioner?
Yeah, sure. I think that when we have these moments of crisis, they are historically times of fundamental and structural change in how we think about the economy. And it is the time for us to be aggressive, think big about how we are actually going to grow the economy again, so that people can get back to work, that ultimately people are safe. So look, I just am not in the mode of saying, let's not talk about things because of dysfunction. I think that's part of organizing, speaking out, and advocating for a position. Because, like Zephyr said, this is not just about Congress. This is about what's happening in state regulators, with state attorneys general, with cities. I mean, there are so many regulatory entities and policymakers who are shaping markets and planning for the recovery. And it's a mistake to think about merger policy narrowly in the context of just antitrust law or just casino licensing in a certain state or just about a bank transfer of license. This is wrong. I mean, we have to expect and understand we may not be seeing a lot of big mega mergers during this disruption right now, but we're going to see a lot of weakened small and medium-sized regional and local enterprises be succumb to further consolidation, which will ultimately really hamper our ability to build employment capacity and respond to the moment.
So I just want to talk about, it's a variation on the commissioner's answer, but I just want to talk about what happened 10 weeks ago. 10 weeks ago, Donald Trump suggested $2.5 billion for a bailout, and Senator Schumer countered asking for $8.5 billion. I think if you had said 100 billion, 200 billion, $1 trillion bailout, at that moment, anybody would have said, that is totally impossible. I'm sorry, I have a crying baby, so I'm a little, we were timing this for nap, and we may have, I may have overshot by a minute. But I do want to talk about what's possible. If you'd said, I'll tell you what's politically impossible. What's politically impossible is a multi-trillion-dollar bailout of companies that are allowed to do stock buybacks and basically enrich themselves at the taxpayers' expense. That is one of the most politically impossible things I can imagine, yet it just happened. So I think we should be totally clear. A merger ban is mild. I think we should be demanding that we break all these companies up, which is where I started. And maybe the answer to the person's question about what's possible is that we should always be going even bigger. But I'll tell you, the political climate can mean different things. The political climate can mean where the people of this country are. And where the people of this country are is based on polling and the anger, the bipartisan anger after the last bailout, is they are not in favor of multi-trillion-dollar, no-strings-attached bailouts that are going to make the richest people in world history richer. They are totally opposed to it. So if that's your political climate question, and where's the political climate of this country? Do people want small businesses to succeed? Absolutely. But right now, they're not getting that. The other political climate question could be, given the systemic corruption in our Congress, a merger ban is unlikely. You may be asking that question. And I guess what I would say is, well, let's ask for it and find out who's opposed and make them tell us why. Because, I mean, I want to hear somebody tell me why they're pro-consolidation at this moment and tell that to their constituents. So I don't know what is possible. And I don't think any of us know what is possible. But if we're going to demand a moral economy, which is what we're talking about an economy where everybody has dignity and where you're not so insecure that next month you don't know where your paycheck is coming from, and you don't have such an insecure healthcare system that we might not have enough beds, and you don't have people who are happy if they make $15 an hour, because we got to be clear that that still is not what people should be making. We need to build a moral economy, and that means that we need to ground our demands in a moral vision, and then let them tell us no and explain why.
Thanks so much. Commissioner Chopra, any last words?
No, thank you everyone for coming. I know that right now there's a lot of regulators, government officials, and we're really seeing where our blind spots are. We are blind to all of the small mergers that are happening in so many sectors and will happen because they are not even filed with us or subject to real oversight. We're blind to a lot of the breakdowns in our supply chains that made us less resilient because we've, prioritized efficiency to the detriment of other values. So we have a lot to do to fix this economy, to fix our society, so that we can get out of this mess, hopefully stronger and more fair for everyone.
Thank you so much. So with that, I just want to thank again Zephyr, Commissioner Chopra, for taking an hour to talk with us. I want to thank everyone who joined this call today for taking the time out of your busy work and lives. And I want to thank everyone who asked really good questions. I'm sorry we did not get to them. We'll continue to have these conversations over the next weeks and months, and we hope you'll continue to engage in them. Our website is www.economicliberties.us. Our contact information is easy to find. We want to be a resource where we can be on some of these questions, and we really do deeply appreciate your engagement and the work that everyone is doing. So stay safe, thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.